So today we are in Ruth. I'll wait until you're ready, Thomas. Okay. Ruth chapter 4, verses 9 through 17. And then we're going to skip to the New Testament. We'll be in Luke chapter 3, verse 23, and then verse 31b and 32. So kind of unusual that we'll have some verses from both texts, Old and New Testament. So we'll begin with Ruth chapter 4, verse 9 through 17. Then Boaz announced to the elders and all the people, "Today you are witnesses that I have bought from Naomi all the property of Elimelech, Chilion, and Mahlon. I have also acquired Ruth the Moabite, Mahlon's widow, as my wife, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property, so that his name will not disappear from among his family or from his hometown. Today you are witnesses." Then the elders and all the people at the gate said, "We are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your home like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the family of Israel. May you have standing in Ephrathah and be famous in Bethlehem. Through the offspring the Lord gives you by this young woman, may your family be like that of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah." So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. When he made love to her, the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. The women said to Naomi, "Praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a guardian redeemer. May he become famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you and who is better to you than 7 sons, has given him birth." Then Naomi took the child in her arms and cared for him. The women living there said, "Naomi has a son," and they named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. In Luke 3:23, 31b, and 32. Now Jesus himself was about 30 years old when he began his ministry. He was the son, so it was thought, of Joseph, the son of Heli, the son of Nathan, the son of David, the son of Jesse, the son of Obed, the son of Boaz, the son of Salmon, the son of Nahshon. Okay, so we're just getting some of the genealogy here today of how things actually came to be with Jesus. It says that we don't really know the exact date or the author of the book of Ruth. We know that it occurred, the period of time was when the judges, it was the time where the judges were in Israel. It's marked by people's recurring failure to keep their covenant with the Lord. But there was a handful of obedience going on, and just a small group of people that still remained faithful to God and were obedient to God. We learn of genealogies all the time, of those that become kings or queens, and when we learn about how that whole process takes place. And so we learn about some of that today as well. So the book of Ruth was written to show God's providence at work in King David's ancestors, whether during or shortly after his kingship or even after Israel was divided in two. This is just a little bit of background. As you could tell when I read the verses, we're not talking about the part where Naomi and Ruth come and that she starts gleaning in the fields, and that I think that's the part of it that we've pretty much heard throughout the years. May not have really heard as much about what happened once Boaz decided to actually make Ruth his wife. But that's kind of what we're talking about more today. So just a little background here. This is covered in Ruth chapter 4, verse 9 through 17. I actually went back and just read Ruth 1 through 4 yesterday. I just think it's such a neat story of how God worked in these two ladies' lives. They decided to go back to Naomi's hometown, which was Bethlehem, and that's where I guess her husband Elimelech had had property. And so once her husband died and Ruth's husband died and Orpah's husband died, so she lost her husband and her 2 sons. And once that had occurred, then Naomi and Ruth decided to go back to Bethlehem. And that's kind of where we are today. If you remember, Ruth was actually foreign born. She was a Moabite. And so for her to travel back to Bethlehem was a little dangerous because Moabites were not really accepted very well in Bethlehem or in that area. They were considered outsiders. And it says that even way back, like in the Old Testament, there was some type of rule that had occurred that they really weren't supposed to go back to that area or weren't accepted well in that area. So it's just a kind of a long-standing history of there being just this feud, I guess you would say, between the groups. So they did face an uncertain future. But Ruth's character and hard work won her favor with Boaz. And Boaz was a relative of Naomi's. Events came to a quick climax. Naomi had a plan to enlist Boaz's help. And Boaz wasted no time in putting his own plan into action. So then we'll start with verse 9. Then Boaz announced to the elders and all the people, "Today you are witnesses that I have bought from Naomi all the property of Elimelech, Chilion, and Mahlon." So we know that when Ruth first arrived in this area, she went out into the fields to glean, where Boaz had workers there, and they would leave some of the barley and things there, or some that wasn't picked up by them. Then she would go in there and pick that up, and then she and her mother-in-law would have food. And Boaz recognized what a hard worker she was. She worked really hard and worked, from sun up to sundown, basically, and he recognized that. He even asked the field master, "Who is this woman? I haven't seen her before." And then he started to recognize that she worked really hard. And then at one point he even told the field master, "Well, leave a little extra and let her collect it." And so this is how, in the beginning, things kind of got started between the two of them. So Boaz's desire was to redeem Naomi's land holdings and to marry Ruth. There is some laws regarding how all this took place, and you can read about that in Leviticus 25 through 34. I looked back at this, and so basically, if a woman's husband died, then maybe a lot of times what would happen is his brother would take over the woman and take over the land. And then at some point, when things got better, then she or maybe a child of hers would take back over the land. So it was really interesting how it all happened, and it was written. It was a written way that things were supposed to happen. And the thing of it was that Boaz was not her brother. He was not Naomi's brother, so he didn't want to overstep and take over Ruth. So he had to go through it in a certain way so that it wouldn't look like that he was overstepping his bounds, basically, is the best way I can explain it. Because of the importance of land in Israel, the bias was to sell the property within a tribe to keep it in the extended family. For this reason, the family member who purchased the land was called a guardian redeemer or kinsman redeemer. So that's kind of what the word for it was. So Boaz stepped in. He took on the role of a guardian redeemer for Naomi by buying the land that had belonged to her husband Elimelech and her sons Mahlon and Chilion. Now, at this meeting, there were at least 10 elders, it says, and this happened a lot. It would occur at a city gate, and it's like instead of going into a courtroom, they would just hold this big meeting right out at the city gate. There were also other witnesses there, and So it was sort of like the witnesses were just there to say, yes, I saw it happen. I saw it all take place. Verse 10, I have also acquired Ruth the Moabite, Mahlon's widow, as my wife, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property, so that his name will not disappear from among his family or from his hometown. Today you are witnesses. So what he actually did, he kind of said the very same words at the end of this verse as he had said in the beginning of verse 9. And it was sort of like an opening statement and then a closing statement. So he was just kind of reinforcing his desire. He was going to make Ruth his wife, and then he was going to kind of take over this land and kind of redeem Naomi for the land. This is sort of like the marriage itself was called a levirate marriage, and so what would happen is if a husband died, the widow was left, then maybe his brother would step in and he would marry her, and then they would have children together and that sort of thing. We will learn a little bit more about that. The reason I bring it up, we're going to see a little bit more about that in some of the verses ahead of us. So first, Ruth was a Moabite, so she was not an Israelite. And as I had mentioned earlier, sometimes there was hard feelings among these two groups of people. So for her to come into this area, she really didn't know how she would be accepted, and I'm sure she was a bit scared about this. But evidently, Naomi had very good standing in this area before she ever left, so the people knew Naomi well, and Ruth was accepted just as well when they moved there. So, as I mentioned earlier, Boaz was not a surviving brother of the deceased husband. He wasn't even Naomi's closest guardian redeemer. So he felt like there could be a pushback, when he was asked to do this. And what happens, it doesn't talk about it in these verses, but I went back and read about this, is Boaz actually approached the person that should have been the one, that guardian keeper. I guess the person that would have been the closest in kin to Naomi, or Naomi's husband, it would have been. And he approached him, and he asked him, did he want to take on this role? And the man said, no, I don't want to. Well, what normally would have happened is he could have been frowned upon because he didn't take on that role. But it was just amazing how God worked all this out, because nothing was said to the man. He wasn't rebuked. Nothing happened. It was as if everybody accepted that Boaz was willing to take on the responsibility. The unnamed man didn't want the responsibility, so everything was fine. There was no problems, and in this way, I feel like all of this was God's work. He was working it all out to where everything was going to be fine. So we know that Boaz exhibited extraordinary integrity, for wanting to provide for Naomi and Ruth. He honored the spirit of the Levirate law with his concern for Mahlon's family line. The firstborn to Boaz and Ruth would be raised as Mahlon's child with his inheritance, so the dead man's name and property would be maintained. So there was a lot that went on just so that he could actually marry Ruth, and then also take on the land and that sort of thing. Boaz's decision to marry Ruth led to a blessing for him. He was included in the genealogy for Jesus. How might choices you make today benefit physical or spiritual descendants? You will never know. I guess we never know what effect our lives will have. We don't know, what will happen from years on. That's why we always just want to be close to God and try to have God to lead us as he would have us to go. Verse 11, then the elders and all the people at the gate said, we are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your home like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the family of Israel. May you have standing in Ephrathah and be famous in Bethlehem. So there again, they're out there at that city gate, and these witnesses are speaking up. It's like they're all so excited that this has happened, and they're wishing blessings on Boaz and Ruth. So it's really amazing just how all this was going about, and everything was going well. To have standing and be famous are blessings for wealth and a good name. The name probably assumed the couple would require children to experience these blessings. So, and we will learn, but I thought it was really neat how they brought up how, with Leah and Rachel and how all of that had taken place. And they bring that up as they're blessing Boaz. It does bring up that the word Ephrathah, it seems to be a name for the area there in Bethlehem or a nearby area. So it's pretty important, I guess, an important region. And it said that it's important because Rachel especially was buried near that area. So it has significance in the history, in the biblical history. Though Ruth was a Moabite, she was also known to be a woman of great character. She left behind her own people because of her love for Naomi and the Lord, without knowing what reception she could expect in Naomi's home. The blessing from the people confirms their acceptance of her and hints at the Lord's pleasure with her. In verse 12, through the offspring the Lord gives you by this young woman, may your family be like that of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah. So this is even going back further in the Old Testament. This was one of those levirate marriages. So Tamar was married to E-R was his name, and died. When I went back and read about this is in Genesis chapter 38, verse 8. You ought to just go back and read about this stuff. It's just amazing. But her husband was actually a very evil man, and God allowed him to die, or he was killed, or somehow he did pass away. So Tamar was left, as a widow at that point. And she was supposed to marry one of his brothers, but that didn't work out either. So he actually died also. So she actually moved back to her father's house, and she had thought that she was not going to, be able to have children and that sort of thing, and this whole levirate marriage was not going to work out. So she tricked Judah. Judah was actually her father-in-law. He was the father of and the other man that passed away. There was supposed to be one more son that Judah had told her that he would allow the man to come to be with her. But she sensed that he wasn't going to allow that to happen. So she actually presented herself as a harlot, had her face covered and stuff. And Judah actually happened to see her in the area. And so he slept with her. And then she conceived twins. Their names were Perez and Zerah. And that whole thing is very interesting, too. When the midwife was getting ready to deliver the first twin, she put a red string around the arm, the hand that was coming forward. So that was going to be the first baby born. That was going to be Zerah. But what happened was somehow in this whole birth process, evidently the arm moved back into the womb, and Perez was born first. And it's spelled P-E-R-E-Z. I would think it would be Perez, but they actually pronounce it Perez with an F. So Perez was born first, and then Zerah. But that was not actually the way it was supposed to have occurred. So the whole thing, I mean, I just found it interesting. I guess, I mean, just with my labor and delivery history, I couldn't quite see how that happened. I guess that was a thing of God too, because that wouldn't have normally happened that way. But anyway, you know, many different things happen when God is involved. So anyway, Perez actually is in the lineage. He's in the genealogy of Jesus. So it's just amazing how God used all these people, you know, to bring about then finally the birth of Jesus. You read about these people. Many of them, they weren't wealthy. You know, many of these people were very plain people, and God used them in order to be part of this line. Verse 13. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. When he made love to her, the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. It's kind of interesting. It seems that she was with her first husband for about 10 years, and she never had children. So maybe this, again, was part of God's plan, because this firstborn child was going to be such a blessing, and it was that union between her and Boaz. So it's just very interesting how this all took place. Verse 14. The women said to Naomi, "Praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a guardian redeemer. May he become famous throughout Israel." So the focus in verses 14 through 17 are mainly on Naomi, Ruth's mother-in-law. And maybe they're speaking more towards her because she had at one time Thank you. Okay, so as we were saying that the women in this area felt that it was really incredible that Ruth had given birth to this baby boy, and that this one child could do more for her than 7 sons could. So the way they presented it, it was like they really knew that this child was going to be super special. In verse 16 and 17, then Naomi took the child in her arms and cared for him. The women living there said, Naomi has a son, and they named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. So we know how important David was in the history of everything. But it was unusual, I felt, that Naomi kind of took over care of the baby. And it said that, Boaz was probably a pretty wealthy man. He had all these fields and everything. And back in those days, it wasn't unusual for a woman to have a wet nurse who came in and nursed her baby. But Naomi wasn't a wet nurse. She just cared for the baby and the child as he grew. She was definitely very much involved in his care. So that's the important part, I think. And I don't know if they kind of brought her, I think they kind of brought Naomi to the forefront because she was from that area, and the women probably were very close to her at some year, probably in some years back before she had moved away. It says this is the only place in the Bible where the women named the baby. So the women named him Obed. I don't think I've actually read that yet. But then Naomi took the child in her arms and cared for him. The women living there said, Naomi has a son, and they named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse and the father of David. Yeah, I'm sorry, I had read that. But anyway, this son, was, and now her grandson was going to be super important to both women. So they named him Obed, and Obed means worshiper or servant. And then it says the latter meaning servant, lending itself to the idea that he would serve as a redeemer for Naomi one day. And then, of course, we know that he would, throughout the line of this child, Obed, Jesus would be born, and he would be a redeemer for all of us. So I think that's kind of how it all plays in. Now we kind of move into our New Testament. It says, over 1,000 years passed between the events recorded in Ruth to the time of Jesus' birth. As one would expect, much changed over the passing generations. So the Davidic kingdom rose, split, and then collapsed in exile. The people had returned to the land, but the kingship had not been restored. In Luke chapter 3, verse 23, now Jesus himself was about 33 years old when he began his ministry. He was the son, so it was thought, of Joseph, the son of Heli. So it brings out that a Levite could begin serving in the tabernacle at around 30 years old. But other texts reflect that it could be like at around age 20 or 25. There was definitely things that a person at that age could do. And Luke adds that he adds the words, it was thought that Jesus was the son of Joseph, because Joseph was his legal father. But we know that Jesus is God's son. So there is some controversy, too, about whether how they looked at the genealogy. Was it actually through Mary's family, or was it through Joseph's family? Some people believe that Joseph was actually the son-in-law of Heli, and Mary would have actually been the daughter. But in Luke and Matthew, that lineage is traced, and there's a few, differences, but it says, don't worry about the differences. Jesus still goes back through the line to David, and that's the point, because we know of the promise that God made to David. In verse 31b, the sons of Nathan, the sons of David. So Nathan was the son of David by Bathsheba. The Gospel of Matthew traces Jesus' line through Solomon rather than Nathan. So it says there were slight differences in the way it was traced, but Jesus can be traced back to David for sure. This relationship was key to Jesus being able to fulfill the promise that God made to David. And that promise was, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, your own flesh and blood, and I will establish his kingdom. He is the one who will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne for his kingdom forever. And that comes from 2 Samuel 7, verse 12 and 13. And that was the promise that God made to David. Verse 32, the son of Jesse, the son of Obed, the son of Boaz, the son of Salmon, the son of Nahshon. So there again, this is still some about the lineage of Jesus and how things took place. It says Nahshon was the tribal leader of Judah during the wilderness period. That was all the way back in like Numbers, if we could read about that. But there was a lot of history there. In conclusion, we learned a lot about Boaz, Ruth, and Naomi, and they can be a great encouragement to each of us. They chose to follow the Lord faithfully. Their faithful deeds and God's faithfulness to their family then brought about all three of them receiving blessings. First of all, the community really responded positively to them. Secondly, God chose to bless his family's faithful action in their own times with a son. Truly, the Lord had turned their mourning into dancing. The blessing continued beyond what Boaz, Ruth, and Naomi experienced for themselves. Israel was blessed by David, the future king, and much further in the future with Jesus, the promised king. This family could never anticipate how their faithfulness would echo through the generations and what a blessing their own blessings would be to the world. We are blessed today to see how God can work through us and for us when we choose to follow him. But the greatest blessing, of course, is living in the kingdom of God, thanks to the sacrifice of our King Jesus. So that is all I have. I'll just say God's faithfulness resounds through the generations. That's our thought to remember. So just remember that God is faithful. He is faithful to all of us. And I hope you all have a great week.